Golden light spills across marble floors, glinting off chandeliers heavy with crystal tears. You stand in a hall where silence feels sacred, broken only by the faint rustle of silk and the sigh of history pressing against gilded walls. The portraits that line this chamber don't just stare, they judge. The Habsburgs, with their finely shaped collars and ornate crowns, gaze at you with a confidence born of divine right. Their empire once stretched across Europe, from Spain to Austria, their motto whispering through centuries, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did, into themselves. Tonight, you're about to learn what happens when the blood that built empires turns toxic. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You breathe in the scent of beeswax and old incense. It's 16th century Vienna, and everything around you glimmers with excess. Tapestries woven from gold thread, the air thick with powdered perfume. But beneath that beauty lies fear. Fear of losing power, fear of losing divine favour, fear of diluting a bloodline said to be chosen by God himself. In this world, marriage isn't about love, it's a transaction. A chess move meant to protect territory, not hearts. You can almost hear the crackle of parchment as royal diplomats sign away futures, sealing unions between uncle and niece, cousin and cousin. The logic seems unshakable. If the blood is sacred, keep it pure. But purity, as you'll see, can be a slow kind of poison. The Habsburgs traced their lineage back to medieval Switzerland, climbing the ladders of European nobility until they perched atop the Holy Roman Empire itself. Their power was absolute, or so they believed. The dynasty became synonymous with grandeur, Catholic devotion, and a near-superstitious obsession with heritage. Yet, while their armies marched across continents, their bedrooms held the seeds of their undoing. Historians still argue whether the family's decline began with greed or ignorance, but there's no doubt it was sealed with a kiss, shared between relatives who carried too much of the same genetic code. You walk through the corridors of the Hofburg Palace, each portrait a clue to what went wrong. Faces blur together, the same pale skin, the same elongated chin, the same haunted eyes. They seem carved from a single mould, and in a way they were. That distinctive Habsburg jaw, known as mandibular prognathism, became both a symbol and a curse. Some artists exaggerated it to flatter royal egos, others softened it to hide deformity. Either way, it told a story their courtiers dared not speak aloud. Even the great painter Velázquez, when capturing the Spanish branch of the family, hinted at the truth. Their beauty was cracking. You catch the whisper of courtiers gossiping behind painted fans, speculating whether the emperor's children will be strong or sickly this time. The women of the court, corseted, powdered, and endlessly polite, carry invisible burdens heavier than their jewelled gowns. Every pregnancy is a national concern, every miscarriage a diplomatic crisis. You can almost sense the tension radiating from those candlelit rooms where queens pray not for love but for survival. And beneath all that ceremony, the genes quietly shuffle, recombining the same ancient strands, generation after generation, until the pattern starts to warp. By the late 1500s, even whispers could not hide what was happening. Children were born fragile, pale, and strange. Some lived short, painful lives. Others survived only to rule with minds clouded by madness or disease. Still, the Habsburgs believed themselves untouchable. God, they thought, had chosen them. And if he had given them a peculiar appearance, perhaps it was proof of their sacred uniqueness. The irony is almost poetic. The more they sought divine purity, the more human fragility consumed them. As you linger in the echoing hall, the chandeliers above you flicker. Somewhere deep in the palace, a child coughs. A reminder that even the most powerful blood can fail its heirs. For now, the dynasty stands tall, glittering and proud. But the cracks are there, hairline fractures in a marble empire. You can't help but wonder, when perfection demands sacrifice, how long before the sacrifice becomes the family itself? You step deeper into the heart of the empire and the air feels tighter now, like the breath of an old cathedral just before the incense hits the flame. The Habsburgs have made marriage into an art form, or maybe a blood sport. Across maps inked in royal blue, You can trace their alliances. Austria weds Spain, Spain weds Austria, and the loop never breaks. Each ceremony promises peace, power, and profit, but never freshness. You watch another gilded carriage roll up to the palace gates, carrying a bride who's also a niece, a cousin, and perhaps, if you drew the tree right, her own great-aunt twice removed. The guests toast to dynastic unity, unaware, or pretending not to notice, that they're drinking to the slow suffocation of their own genetic future. In this court, love is a formality. Every match is calculated like interest on a loan. You can imagine the letters traded between Vienna and Madrid, written by trembling scribes who understand that one misstep could spark a war. For the good of the realm, they write, as a girl of 15 crosses borders to marry a man who could be her uncle. The candles flicker over her pale face as she practices the smile expected of a queen. She doesn't know it yet, but her children will inherit more than jewels. They'll inherit mutations, depression, and fragile bodies designed for tragedy. Historians still argue whether the Habsburgs understood what they were doing or if they simply refused to see the pattern. Either way, the results were the same, a dynasty that became its own experiment in genetic isolation. You can almost hear the soft shuffle of steps in the grand ballroom. Courtiers twirl beneath frescoed ceilings, laughing beneath masks, the same surnames murmured in endless rotation. The musicians play a waltz so familiar it feels inbred, looping endlessly like the family tree itself. The irony isn't lost on you. These are people who ruled much of Europe, who commanded armies, conquered territories, and dictated faith itself, yet they could not escape their obsession with purity. They believed their lineage was God's chosen vessel, a holy thread that must never fray. But the tighter they wove it, the weaker it became. Somewhere a royal physician scribbles notes in Latin, describing nervous weakness in a young archduke, melancholia in a princess, or infantile frailty in a newborn prince who will never walk. The doctors don't yet know about genes or chromosomes, but they sense something's wrong. They whisper that the royal blood spoils itself. You imagine the tension in those medical chambers, the flicker of candlelight on worried faces as they record yet another stillbirth, another malformed heir. The data is damning, even if the vocabulary isn't ready for it. By the 1600s, the marriage web is almost self-parody. The family tree looks less like a tree and more like a tangled knot. Emperor Maximilian I married his cousin, his grandson Philip II of Spain married his niece, and down the line the branches fold in on themselves until you can barely tell where one generation ends and the next begins. It's as if time itself has been looping in royal satin. In a cruel twist of fate, this very system, the one designed to keep outsiders out, becomes the dynasty's undoing. The enemy isn't foreign invaders, it's recessive genes, lying in wait like ghosts in the bloodstream. A fringe theory whispers that the Habsburgs' obsession with intermarriage wasn't just political, it was spiritual. Some believed their bloodline carried divine essence, that marrying beyond it would dilute the sanctity of their claim to rule. Whether or not they truly believed this or merely used it as convenient propaganda is anyone's guess. But you can picture it, can't you? Priests nodding solemnly as yet another royal wedding joins two branches of the same root, blessing the union in the name of eternal strength. It's all so dramatic, so grand, and so fatally misguided. You linger at the edge of the ballroom as the music fades. The guests bow and curtsy, but there's a subtle unease behind their smiles. Even the portraits seem to watch suspiciously, like they know what's coming. The empire's foundation still looks solid from a distance, but inside something's collapsing. You can feel it in the air, the fatigue of centuries pressed into one suffocating moment, and as the torches dim and the last carriage rolls away, you're left with the faint echo of a dynasty dancing itself into extinction. You wake to the cold glow of morning creeping through cathedral windows, dust swirling like tired confetti over portraits that no longer inspire awe, but pity. The Habsburgs' faces, once symbols of divine majesty, now tell a quieter, more tragic story. You can trace it in their bone structure, the unmistakable jut of the chin, the elongated lower lip, the slack jaw that refuses to close. It's called the Habsburg jaw, a physical signature so distinctive it could serve as a family crest. And here's the haunting part. It didn't come from one generation. It took centuries of intermarriage to carve that deformity into royal flesh. You can almost imagine the bones beneath the skin rearranging themselves with every cousin's kiss, sculpting a dynasty's downfall one chromosome at a time. You stare into a painting of Emperor Charles V, ruler of a world where the sun famously never set. He looks noble, yes, but there's something off. A drooping mouth, a heavy chin that casts its own shadow. He tries to meet your gaze with imperial confidence, yet his expression wavers between authority and weariness. Artists of the time weren't blind. They just knew where their paychecks came from. Still, even the most flattering brushstrokes couldn't hide what everyone saw. Chronic jaw deformity, difficulty speaking, trouble chewing. Some whispered it was a sign of divine favour. Others joked that even God couldn't get a word in edgewise. It's easy to dismiss these portraits as exaggerations, but medical historians have actually traced the deformity through 16 generations of Habsburgs. That's not rumour, it's genetic archaeology. A 2019 study, for example, quantified it. The more the Habsburgs married within their family, the more severe the mandibular prognathism became. The pattern isn't subtle, it's mathematical. Each union between blood relatives increased the genetic load. The odds that recessive traits would express themselves like dark ink bleeding through silk. You can't help but think how horrifyingly poetic that is. The pursuit of purity making the body impure. Of course, the jaw was only the visible symptom. Behind those regal faces there were hidden costs, speech impairments, chronic drooling, and the occasional royal portrait session cut short because the emperor couldn't physically close his mouth. Imagine being a monarch who rules millions but struggles to pronounce your own decrees. It's almost Shakespearean in its irony. The court physicians, desperate for explanations, tried everything. Herbs, holy water, even jaw braces made of silver. Nothing worked. And because medicine couldn't name the disease, the priest did. It was divine mystery. Convenient, isn't it? You find yourself in the antechamber where foreign envoys once waited to meet the emperor. They whispered behind fans and lace handkerchiefs about La cara de los Habsburgo, the Habsburg face. Some called it majestic, others monstrous. For a dynasty obsessed with image, it was the cruelest betrayal imaginable. Their power visible not in beauty but in deformity. Still, they doubled down, insisting that their distinct look was proof of chosen blood. Historians still argue whether this stubborn pride was ignorance, arrogance, or survival instinct. Either way, it became a mask the family never took off. A quirky little fact hides in the archives. Spanish sculptors were actually instructed to downplay the chin in royal statues, while Austrian artists sometimes exaggerated it to distinguish their rulers from others. In art, deformity became branding. You can almost hear the conversations. Make him look strong, but not too Habsburg. It's morbidly funny in that Renaissance way, where beauty standards and propaganda blend until no one remembers which is which. The portraits that once glorified empire now serve as forensic evidence of its rot. You walk away from the gallery and into the quieter corners of the palace, where mirrors are shrouded under cloth. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe no one wants to confront what they've become. The reflection isn't flattering anymore. Not just the face, but the whole idea of royal blood as perfection. You feel a chill as you realise that what doomed the Habsburgs wasn't a single deformity or a single bad marriage. It was the unwavering belief that they could defy nature itself, and nature, patient as it is, always collects. The air grows heavier as you drift toward the private chambers, the ones where women whisper prayers into embroidered pillows and midwives hold their breath beside candle flames. Here, queens and archduchesses live not as people but as vessels. Their worth isn't measured in intellect or charm, but in the strength of their wombs. You can almost hear the murmured questions echoing through these stone walls. Will she bear a son? Will he survive the winter? Will his jaw close? The candlelight flickers over portraits of women barely out of girlhood, dressed in brocade heavy enough to crush a spirit. They were the glue holding an empire together, but they were also its most expendable parts. You follow one young queen, Maria Anna of Austria, as she walks down the long hallway toward her wedding. She's marrying her uncle, Philip IV of Spain, a man twice her age, whose chin juts forward like a curse she's about to inherit. The priests call it divine providence, the courtiers call it policy. She calls it duty, though you can see the tremor in her gloved hands. She's only 15, and her role is already written. Conceive, deliver, repeat. Her pregnancies will be chronicled like military victories, her miscarriages buried in silence. Historians still argue whether she knew the risks, but you suspect she did. It's hard not to notice when the babies don't live long enough for christenings. In this world, motherhood is warfare fought in the dark. Royal women are treated like living contracts, bound to dynastic goals that ignore their pain. Some of them die in childbirth, others die in despair. The midwives who attend them learn to keep secrets. They burn the linens, whisper to priests, and pray the next child will look less familiar. But it rarely does. You picture those dimly lit rooms, the mingled scent of rosewater and blood, the trembling hands of a monarch waiting for a cry that never comes. The silence afterward feels like a verdict. The Habsburgs' obsession with family purity didn't just shape their genes, it shaped their gender politics. Women were expected to breed loyalty, not question it. And yet, beneath the suffocating expectations, a few dared to rebel quietly. Some confided in servants, others sought confession more for comfort than absolution. One legend, half gossip, half history, tells of a queen who secretly ordered portraits of her stillborn children, each one painted with angel wings. It was her way of making their short, tragic lives visible in a dynasty that preferred to pretend nothing was wrong. You can almost see her staring at the tiny faces, her lips trembling as she wonders if she's cursed or simply unlucky. The irony is sharp enough to taste. A family obsessed with preserving its name systematically destroyed its future through the very women who carried it forward. Each generation produced fewer heirs, and those who survived often carried the same genetic weaknesses: infertility, seizures, and immune fragility. Yet the priests kept blessing every union, insisting that God's will would cleanse the line. The physicians, meanwhile, took meticulous notes on the weakness of the royal uterus, as if the womb itself were conspiring against empire. You can almost imagine their ink-stained fingers trembling as they record another royal death, another failed hope. And then there's the unspoken cruelty, the pressure on these women to produce sons. Daughters were diplomatic currency, sons were insurance policies. When a queen failed to deliver one, whispers spread faster than plague. Some were sent away under the guise of illness, others lived in quiet exile, their portraits hidden behind drapery. But a few, stronger than anyone realized, turned to faith. They built chapels, sponsored convents, and turned their grief into power, reshaping the church's narrative to reclaim a fragment of dignity. It's one of history's quieter revolutions, one born from the cradle rather than the sword. As the candles gutter and the air thickens with incense, you sense the echoes of centuries of prayers unanswered. The dynasty's women, those silent architects of fate, are fading into the margins of history, remembered only for the children they bore or buried. Yet their endurance lingers, woven into the empire's crumbling DNA. You leave their chambers with the unsettling thought that the Habsburgs' most devastating inheritance wasn't a jawline or a mutation. It was the belief that control over life itself was ever theirs to claim. You move through the palace corridors as the air turns strange, too quiet, too heavy, as if the walls themselves remember every whispered confession. Here, in these candlelit rooms, madness takes the throne long before the next coronation. The Habsburgs, obsessed with purity and piety, have begun to unravel from within. You see it in their eyes, those deep, tired hollows where paranoia breeds and melancholy festers. The priests call it divine suffering, but it's more likely inherited despair, passed down like jewellery no one wants to wear. You pause near a tapestry of angels and saints, the threads faded from centuries of candle smoke, and you swear you can hear the scratching of a quill in some dark corner, recording another royal breakdown as just another Tuesday. Take Emperor Rudolph II, for instance. His court was filled with alchemists, astrologers, and mechanical toys that moved on their own, early machines that looked like magic. But the man behind all that wonder lived in terror of his own mind. He locked himself away for days, convinced demons whispered in his ear, refusing to eat or bathe, letting his kingdom drift into chaos. Historians still argue whether Rudolph was schizophrenic, bipolar, or simply crushed under the weight of absolute power, but either way, his blood carried something heavier than gold. His letters to his brother, desperate and rambling, read like a man drowning in his own thoughts. You can almost picture him pacing in a candlelit chamber, muttering to himself as the empire outside his window begins to fracture. And Rudolph wasn't alone. Across the family line, mental instability appeared like clockwork. Anxiety, depression, violent rages, fits of religious hysteria. The Habsburgs, raised to believe they were God's chosen, lived under the unbearable pressure of being both divine and human. Imagine growing up in a palace where everyone bows to you, but no one looks you in the eye, where your tutors remind you daily that the world rests on your shoulders, but your reflection reminds you that your mouth won't close properly. That's enough to drive anyone mad, crown or not. It's like inheriting both a throne and a curse in the same cradle. You wander into a gallery where the portraits tell stories words won't. One king grips his rosary with white-knuckled fervour, another stares off into nothing, his gaze vacant but haunted. Beneath the oil paint and velvet collars, there's a pattern, a kind of ancestral exhaustion. These people aren't just rulers, they're patients, and the family physician knows it too. His notes, hidden in dusty archives, speak of episodes of melancholy and mystical delusions. Translation: your emperor thinks he's both chosen by God and cursed by him. It's the kind of irony that would make even the saints laugh, if they weren't already rolling their eyes. A curious detail often overlooked. Some of the Habsburg men showed signs of what we'd now call epilepsy, or perhaps temporal lobe dysfunction, conditions that can warp mood, perception, even personality. One archduke was said to fall into trances mid-sentence, his eyes rolling back as courtiers pretended not to notice. Another was known to speak to portraits, insisting they answered back. Maybe they did. The line between faith and hallucination was paper-thin, in an age where miracles and madness wore the same face. You can almost imagine a confessor leaning close, whispering, "You're touched by heaven," when the truth was far less romantic. As you walk through these haunted halls, the sound of footsteps, your own or theirs, seems to echo in double time. You can feel the claustrophobia of a dynasty trapped inside its own mind. And yet, despite the visible unravelling, the family refused to admit weakness. Madness became heritage, sanctified, and wrapped in gold. Even now, some biographers soften the truth, calling them melancholic visionaries instead of what they really were, victims of a genetic web they could never escape. A shadow passes over a candle, and for a fleeting second, you swear you see the outline of Charles II's face forming in the flame, the last and most broken heir of them all. His story, still waiting in the dark, is where this legacy of inbreeding reaches its cruel crescendo. But that's for another night's whisper. For now, the madness hums softly in the walls, the ghosts of emperors murmuring prayers to a god who may have stopped listening long ago. You hear the sound before you see him, a weak, rasping breath, a faint shuffle of velvet against marble. When you finally step into the royal nursery, the air feels wrong, too still for a place meant for life. The boy lying there is Charles II of Spain, the last of the Habsburg line, and the living proof that too much royal blood can kill a dynasty from the inside out. His head is large, his jaw misshapen, his tongue too big for his mouth. His eyes, though wide and alert, have the heavy look of someone who was never meant to carry the world's weight. You can almost feel the pity of the courtiers hovering behind their masks, bowing to a child they already know will not last. Charles was born in 1661, the only surviving son of Philip IV and his niece, Mariana of Austria, both descendants of generations of intra-family unions. The royal doctors celebrated his birth with fireworks, not realising they were welcoming the end. From the moment he drew breath, everything about Charles screamed fragility. He could barely swallow, barely walk, and spoke only in garbled phrases that frightened the servants. His nurses whispered that he was bewitched, while the priests prescribed exorcisms instead of medicine. You can picture it, a trembling boy surrounded by candles, his mother praying aloud while holy water drips down his cheeks. Historians still argue whether his deformities were purely genetic or compounded by disease, but either way, the curse of the Habsburgs had finally found its masterpiece. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. The nickname fit too well. His reign was less rule and more spectacle, a tragic puppet show directed by those who claimed to serve him. Ministers, priests, and relatives fought over his throne while Charles sat trapped inside a body that betrayed him daily. His jaw jutted so far forward he couldn't chew. He swallowed his food whole. His tongue was so swollen he could barely speak. The royal physicians recorded every symptom in excruciating detail, noting his seizures, his chronic infections, his stunted growth, his infertility. The list read like a diagnosis written by nature itself. And yet, Somehow, he lived, longer than anyone expected. Into his 30s, against all odds, Charles ruled a dying empire from his ornate, suffocating palace. He believed himself cursed by witches, a superstition his courtiers encouraged to distract from the truth. The Habsburgs had cursed themselves. Even his 2 marriages to French and Austrian princesses brought no heirs. His body, like his dynasty, was sterile. The irony stings. Generations of inbreeding to preserve the bloodline, and the result is a king who cannot continue it. You almost want to laugh, except it isn't funny. It's tragic in slow motion. One physician, trying to make sense of the impossible, once described Charles as a man of 35, aged prematurely, who can neither walk nor talk, and who looks more dead than alive. That might sound cruel, but imagine being that man, trapped between reverence and ridicule, adored and pitied, feared and ignored. Every morning his attendants dressed him like a doll, painting his face to hide the pallor, arranging his stiff limbs to appear regal. And every night they carried him to bed like a relic, whispering prayers that the next sunrise might finally be his last. But Charles clung to life, perhaps out of sheer stubbornness, perhaps because the dynasty refused to let him die until the story was complete. His death in 1700 marked more than the end of a man. It ended a royal line that had ruled half of Europe for centuries. When doctors performed an autopsy, legend says his body was found without a single drop of blood, his heart the size of a peppercorn, and his intestines rotted and putrid. The descriptions may be exaggerated, but they fit the legend perfectly. The final Habsburg, hollowed out by the empire he was meant to preserve. You leave the room and glance back once more. The candlelight flickers across his portrait, thin, pale and weary. There's a strange peace in his painted eyes, as if he finally understands what the living never did. That power without humility is a sickness, and purity without balance is its slowest poison. The dynasty's final breath leaves the air cold, and for the first time in generations, the silence in the palace isn't holy, it's merciful. Centuries later you find yourself standing in a sterile white laboratory instead of a candlelit palace, but the ghosts of the Habsburgs are here too, preserved in jars, bones and bloodlines. It's the 21st century, and science has finally caught up with rumour. Geneticists, historians and anthropologists have reopened the case, trading holy water for DNA tests. The story you've been following through dim halls and whispered prayers is now rewritten in genetic code, and every sequence tells the same thing. The empire that once ruled by divine right fell because its own genes turned against it. The divine blood wasn't holy, it was dangerously concentrated. You can almost hear the irony humming through the lab equipment. In 2019, a team of Spanish researchers published what they called a quantitative reconstruction of Habsburg genetics. They analysed portraits, genealogies, and the known degrees of consanguinity, how closely related each generation really was. Their conclusion hit harder than any prophecy. The last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II, had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25, roughly equivalent to the child of a brother and sister. That's not metaphorical royalty, that's biological catastrophe. Historians still argue whether the dynasty understood the consequences, but the math doesn't lie. The line that once stretched across Europe collapsed not from war or rebellion, but from within the womb. The scientists didn't stop at numbers. They exhumed royal remains, analysing bones and teeth for signs of malnutrition, deformity and disease. Beneath the velvet and gold, the bodies told a story of systemic frailty, osteoporosis, cranial asymmetry, malformed jaws. The royal physicians had written of nervous temperaments and divine ailments. Now we know they were describing epilepsy, endocrine disorders, and congenital defects that science can explain but history once mystified. You imagine those modern researchers, their gloves dusted with centuries of royal decay, realising they're holding proof that empires can rot at the molecular level. And yet, it's not just the science that fascinates, it's the psychology. Why did they keep doing it? Even after generations of weak heirs, miscarriages and stillbirths, the Habsburgs continued to marry within their own family. Was it arrogance, religious conviction, or simply fear that marrying outside would make them mortal again? Historians still debate this, pointing to letters where emperors spoke of protecting the sanctity of divine lineage. Maybe they believed that love, if you could call it that, was a luxury only peasants could afford. Maybe they truly thought their blood was too precious to share. But nature, patient as it is, doesn't care for royal signatures. A quirky tidbit buried in one of those studies mentions that even the artists of the Habsburg court unwittingly served as early genetic record keepers. Their portraits, once seen as flattery, became forensic evidence. The way a chin juts or an eye droops tells more about heredity than any archive. It's macabrely poetic. Art as DNA, paint as proof. Some scientists actually cross-reference jaw angles from portraits with genetic probabilities, confirming that the deformities weren't artistic exaggerations. They were family likenesses written in bone. The empire had left its genome on canvas. As you stand amid the hum of refrigeration units and soft whirring machines, the grandeur of history feels small compared to the simplicity of a genetic sequence. You realise that the Habsburg tragedy isn't ancient, it's human. It's the same story of hubris that repeats across centuries, whether in royal courts or corporate towers. The idea that control can conquer chaos, that perfection can be engineered, that heritage matters more than health. It never ends well. Every strand of DNA pulled from those bones whispers the same warning: power that isolates itself always self-destructs. The lead researcher in a quiet interview once said, "The Habsburgs were an experiment that ran too long." You smile at the understatement. 600 years of ambition undone by biology, a divine comedy of chromosomes. You imagine the spirits of emperors and queens hovering over these microscopes, still trying to understand how their grand palaces led to glass slides and pipettes. If ghosts could blush, the Habsburgs surely would. Their greatest empire wasn't Spain or Austria. It was the illusion that they were untouchable. And now, centuries later, even their DNA tells a different story. That bloodlines, no matter how royal, are only human after all. You leave the laboratory's sterile light and step back into the echo of palaces, where the scent of beeswax and damp stone still lingers. The empire, though outwardly majestic, is beginning to sag under its own weight. The Habsburgs' palaces, once radiant with ceremony, now feel like ornate tombs for living ghosts. You can almost hear the echoes of footsteps through long galleries as servants hurry to hide cracks in the marble and leaks in the ceilings. The empire isn't collapsing in an instant, it's decaying quietly, gracefully, like a grand chandelier dimming one candle at a time. You glance through a window overlooking the Danube and see soldiers drilling in the courtyard. They look strong, but the command from above has lost its edge. The dynasty that once made kings tremble now trembles itself. Wars still rage on the edges of the empire, against the Ottomans, against France, against debt. The Habsburgs throw money and men into battles they can no longer afford. Their power is slipping like sand through the fingers of an aging monarch. By the 17th century, the once mighty Spanish branch is gasping, bankrupt and politically cornered, while the Austrian branch strains to hold what's left of the Holy Roman Empire. You can sense the desperation beneath their diplomatic smiles. Treaties are signed not out of triumph, but exhaustion. Historians still argue whether the empire's decline was inevitable, due to geography, bureaucracy, or sheer bad luck. But the truth feels simpler when you walk these haunted halls. It was doomed the moment it began to fold in on itself. Inside the court, the mood is brittle. The endless etiquette, the pageantry, the hierarchy. It all continues like theatre, even as the audience vanishes. You imagine a banquet table stretching endlessly under chandeliers, each place setting gleaming, the laughter brittle and hollow. The courtiers pretend nothing is wrong, but even the food tastes like decline, imported, expensive, and tasteless. The monarchs grow increasingly reclusive, obsessed with ceremony over substance. A king's trembling hand signs decrees he barely understands, while ministers whisper behind embroidered fans, plotting how to keep the illusion of divine stability alive a little longer. There's something almost tender about it, the way everyone conspires not to wake the dying giant. A small but chilling irony hides in the archives. As the royal bodies weakened, their symbols of power grew heavier. Crowns became thicker, robes more elaborate, portraits grander. It's as if they tried to decorate themselves out of decay. Even the architecture changed. The later Habsburg palaces expanded upward and outward, with facades built to impress visiting envoys while the interiors crumbled. You can picture it. Flaking frescoes, drafty corridors, and a queen huddled near a brazier because the hearths no longer heat the stone. The empire's beauty turns ghostly, a trick of candlelight masking fatigue. Economically, the situation isn't much better. The silver from the Americas, the very lifeblood of Habsburg wealth, has dwindled. Inflation gnaws at the empire like termites in the walls. Soldiers go unpaid, peasants riot, and nobles quietly shift their loyalties toward rising powers like France and England. You can almost hear the sound of coins clattering in the treasuries, too few to echo properly, and yet the dynasty insists it will endure. The motto, AEIU, Austriae est imperare orbi universo, or it is Austria's destiny to rule the world, still adorns their seals, though now it feels more like a prayer than a statement. What's most tragic isn't the loss of territory or wealth, it's the loss of vitality. The Habsburgs, once symbols of political and religious certainty, have become caricatures of stagnation. Even the church, once their strongest ally, begins to shift away, favouring younger, more flexible monarchies. You can imagine the cardinals in Rome shaking their heads. Too much ceremony, not enough faith. A new age of reason is dawning outside the palace walls, but inside the clocks tick in slow, divine time, refusing to move forward. And still, the women of the dynasty keep trying, hosting salons, arranging marriages, holding the fabric together with embroidery and endurance. But the empire is tired. Its bloodline is tired. Even its music sounds slower, the harpsichords mournful rather than jubilant. You linger in one last ballroom, where a royal couple glides in practice steps, smiling for an audience that no longer believes in them. The chandeliers shimmer weakly, and for a moment you could swear the glass tiers hanging from them aren't decorative. They're mourning. The empire is still standing, but only out of habit. You walk through corridors that feel more like mausoleums than halls of power. The portraits of long-dead emperors seem to lean toward you now, their painted eyes hollowed by hindsight. The Habsburg dream of divine unity, of eternal rule, has thinned into a sigh. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, what's left of their vast dominion feels like an old machine kept running out of stubbornness. The gears grind, the oil's gone, but still they crank the handle. The world outside has changed. Revolutions rumble through France, philosophy questions faith, and people begin to whisper about democracy. But here, within the velvet-draped rooms of Vienna, time refuses to move forward. You can almost taste the denial in the air, sweet as rotting fruit. The later Habsburgs cling to formality as if it's oxygen. Every morning, servants still lay out ceremonial gloves and swords. Ministers still bow 3 times before speaking. The empire still prints coins with the double-headed eagle, symbol of power over east and west, though by now that eagle looks more weary than regal. You imagine the sound of quills scratching on decrees that no one intends to obey, the muffled laughter of courtiers who no longer fear the crown. Even the common people have stopped believing that royal blood is sacred. They care more about bread than blessings, but inside the palace the family still insists, we are eternal. Historians still argue whether this stubborn faith was courage or delusion. Maybe both. You drift into the grand study of Emperor Franz Joseph, a man who somehow managed to keep the empire stitched together for 7 decades through sheer willpower and routine. Every morning he woke before dawn, dressed himself in military precision, and worked until nightfall. He believed discipline could replace vitality, that order could compensate for decay. But his private life was a graveyard of tragedy. His wife, Elizabeth, Sisi, restless and melancholic, murdered by an anarchist. His son, Rudolf, heir to the throne, dead by suicide. You can almost hear Franz Joseph whispering to himself in the silence of his study, duty above all. He ruled until 1916, his empire already rotting from within, his heart long broken. Outside his window, history gathered its storm. Nationalism surged in Hungary, Serbia, and across the Balkans. Empires built on divine right couldn't survive a world where men began to ask why some were born to serve and others to rule. The Habsburgs didn't see it coming, not because they were blind, but because they refused to believe history could change without their permission. You think of their motto, let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It had worked once, but now marriage couldn't save them. Love was a luxury, and politics no longer obeyed bloodlines. The family that once united Europe through weddings now watched it unravel through revolutions. A strange, almost comedic footnote. In the late 1800s, visitors to the Viennese court noted how eerily similar the Habsburg cousins still looked. The jaw persisted, less pronounced, but unmistakable. One French ambassador wrote that you could spot a Habsburg by silhouette alone. It was no longer a badge of honour, it was a reminder. Even as science advanced, their faces carried the memory of centuries of inbreeding, the living ghosts of their own dynasty. The empire might have modernised on paper, but its blood still belonged to another century. Then comes 1914. A gunshot in Sarajevo echoes through the marble halls like thunder. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is dead, and with him, the last fragile illusion of control. You can almost hear the panic ripple through the corridors, the shattering of glass, the rustle of telegrams. The war that follows will swallow the world and finally bury the Habsburg Empire for good. When it ends in 1918, the last emperor, Charles I, is exiled, stripped of title, crown, and homeland. The centuries-long experiment in divine blood is over. He leaves Vienna quietly, his family in tow, carrying more ghosts than luggage. The palace doors close behind him, and for the first time since the Middle Ages, Europe breathes without a Habsburg at its centre. You stand in the empty halls now, the air still heavy with candle wax and regret. The portraits remain, but their gazes have softened. No more arrogance, no more illusions, just a kind of sad relief. The empire didn't explode in fury, it faded in exhaustion, undone not by enemies but by its own reflection. And somewhere in that silence, you realise the dynasty didn't just lose its power, it finally lost its myth. You linger in the empty corridors long after the last royal footsteps have faded. The air feels different now, lighter, freer, but touched by the ache of what's been lost. The Habsburgs are gone, their banners folded, their thrones dust-covered curiosities in museum halls. Yet their story refuses to die. It lingers in textbooks, portraits, and most hauntingly, in the DNA of descendants scattered across Europe. When people look at those portraits today, they don't see divine authority. They see a warning, written not in ink, but in bone. You find yourself staring into those same painted faces one last time, and you realise the Habsburgs didn't just rule history, they embodied it, suffered for it, and ultimately became its lesson. Modern descendants still exist, some as politicians, others as quiet aristocrats living ordinary lives. None hold crowns anymore. Some even joke about their family chin, though the laughter carries an echo of unease. They've traded palaces for modest estates, servants for salaried jobs, divine right for democracy. You can almost imagine one of them scrolling through a family tree online, tracing the lines that once bound half of Europe, realising those same lines nearly destroyed it. The geneticists have moved on, the empires have crumbled, but the legacy of the Habsburgs still glows faintly in the background of European identity, like an ember refusing to go out. Historians still argue over what the dynasty truly represented. Was it brilliance or arrogance, faith or obsession? Maybe it was all of it at once. The Habsburg story is a mirror held up to human ambition, the desire to perfect, to preserve, to control. They believed their bloodline was sacred, that by keeping it pure they could keep their power eternal. But life doesn't work that way. Blood demands variety. Evolution rewards adaptation, not stubbornness. The Habsburgs mistook stagnation for stability, and the result was slow decay dressed in gold. Their legacy is less a fall from grace than a quiet reminder that nature, not nobility, always has the final say. One detail rarely mentioned in the grand histories. The people of Vienna mourned them anyway. When Emperor Franz Joseph died, thousands lined the streets in the rain, bowing their heads as the cortege passed. Even those who no longer believed in monarchy wept for the end of an era. You can almost hear the church bells tolling, the soft sobs of old women who had never seen the emperor but felt they'd lost a father. That's the strange power of dynasties. They haunt you even when you know they shouldn't. They are stories we inherit, myths we cling to, symbols of something greater than ourselves, even when their truth is anything but pure. A fringe theory among cultural historians suggests that the Habsburg obsession with purity wasn't just about blood, it was about time. They wanted to freeze history, to create a permanent present where nothing ever changed. You look around at the world now, new powers rising, old ones fading, and realise we're not so different. Maybe that's why the Habsburgs still fascinate us. They remind us how easy it is to mistake control for immortality. Every empire, every dynasty, every family that thinks it can outwit change eventually meets the same quiet reckoning. The Habsburgs were simply the most beautiful version of that mistake. You stand at the threshold of their vanished world. The marble glows pale in moonlight, and for a moment you think you see a reflection, the curve of a jaw, the shimmer of a crown. But it's only your own shadow. You exhale, slow and steady. The story feels complete, not because it ended well, but because it ended at all. The Habsburgs were undone by their own perfectionism, by their desire to remain uncorrupted in a world that demands evolution. Their tragedy was not that they failed to rule forever, it's that they tried. So you let the silence settle. The chandeliers are dark now, the marble cool beneath your fingertips. The ghosts of the Habsburgs drift somewhere between memory and myth, their empire scattered like dust motes in candlelight. You can almost hear the faint strains of a forgotten waltz fading through the corridors, each note a sigh of what once was. It's strange, isn't it? How stories that end in decay still feel so alive. Maybe it's because the Habsburgs were never just rulers. They were mirrors for all of us, proof that the human need to preserve what we love can sometimes destroy it. As the room grows still, you imagine closing those heavy palace doors one last time. Outside, the night waits, quiet, infinite, forgiving. You take a slow breath, letting the past drift away like smoke from an extinguished candle. Whatever remains of that ancient bloodline is now just a whisper in the veins of history, and that's enough. The world moves on, softer, wiser, lighter. Sleep well, traveller of time.